Hi, this is Heather from Keduzi, and I'm really excited to get to have a conversation with Chris, and I'll explain what it's about. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Chris Sayson. I'm from the Philippines. So I'm just renaming myself right now because I just remembered that this is an international um, conversation with lots of people from lots of different places. And yeah, I'm from the Philippines and I'm in the Philippines right now. And I've been doing quite a bit of work with some groups on food sovereignty here in the Philippines. And I've also worked with Possible Futures, which is a collective of women from the Global South who are really all about empowering the Global South perspective and um, generating pluriversality in the face of civilizational collapse, which is essentially what's going on right now. Like we're it's 2022, so we're having a fun time, aren't we?
Yes, I'm always shocked still when it's like 2022. Are you serious?
Yeah, right.
Where'd that come
It's not
from?
a
It's
real
still
year.
2020.
Yeah, this is like week 704 of 2020.
It is. I'm not, no one can convince me otherwise.
Yeah.
So yeah, we met through Deep Adaptation Forum, and
Oh no, I
which
think it was
is
PC Collab.
oh yeah,
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 we
yeah.
met through
We
PC
met through
Collab.
there, which for me was like a deep adaptation.
Oh, it was an
Like it was
extension.
people from Deep Adaptation that said, "Oh, do you want to come to this conversation?" So that's how it feels for me. Um, and Deep Adaptation is about like how to their tagline is, like a loving response to collapse kind of thing. So it is based around the collapse narrative, which I refer to a lot in Keduzi. And so you and I have had several conversations in the past year about how to collaborate. And one of the things that came out was that you were interested in kind of applying the white supremacy culture patterns, ideas of Tima Okun to what's happening in the Philippines with elections. And as my goal with Keduzi is to bring kind of the white Western middle class mindset into a place of humility and curiosity about what's going on in places that benefit the least from our current system. And so the idea that a lot of people could be afraid of collapse because we can't imagine a system where we don't benefit. It's coming from a place of privilege. And so I really want to have more of these conversations with people around the world, but especially with you, Chris. And so I'd love to, hear what's going on over there, how you see that these patterns are playing out, even in the Philippines, that it's not just some kind of the US, the UK, white supremacy culture patterns that, so that we can kind of unpick the complexity going on here. So share away.
Awesome. Okay, so I kind of want to respond first of all, Heather, to what you said about deep adaptation forums, um, wanting to have a loving response to collapse. I'd love to point out that that's a luxury because here, for instance, we just had a super typhoon, like literally not just a typhoon, but a super typhoon that flattened a minimum of 5 provinces. In fact, my home province right now, where I'm in Bacolod City. which is in Central Philippines, the Visayas Island group, is still recovering. There are still branches of trees hanging kind of like this because of the typhoon. And the thing is, we're protected by this beautiful mountain range, the Marapara mountain range. So we weren't as badly hit as, say, nearby islands like Cebu, which still doesn't have water, still doesn't have electricity. And they spent Christmas and New Year's that way. So collapse is happening right now. And to say, oh, I'm going to be nice and loving about it is just a little bit nice for you, but not available for us, shall we say. Which is, I think it's not about feeling the urgency, but it's more about being aware that being loving can also mean being forceful and decisive and rageful, because rage can come from a place of deep, deep love, especially when you see that there is profound injustice going on. And I think that would kind of lead us into the conversation about white supremacy culture that that I wanted to have actually with a lot of folks here in the Philippines, but unfortunately I made a few mistakes. Like the link was, I think I sent a broken link, so my bad. But just for a little bit of context, the Philippines has been under the regime of, shall we say, a fascist authoritarian crony of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, where essentially we are being sold off piecemeal to a lot of agents of China, to the Chinese government, including the Spratly Islands, which we know to be the Kalayaan Island group. Kalayaan means freedom, so and that's just in one of the languages of the Philippines. Kalayaan means freedom in Tagalog. So there's I'm Hiligaynon, so I speak a different language from a lot of. I speak a different language from the national language of the Philippines. So just a little bit of context there. And for instance, we have an oil, not oil, natural gas field that's been sold off to a Chinese Filipino, well, or I think just plain Chinese, like business person who bought it on loan. It's basically just a very messy, kind of questionable, kind of cronyistic situation that I won't go into details about because it's icky and complicated and that'll take too much time. But basically, yeah, the Philippines has been under this kind of weird crony capitalist regime since 2016. And we have elections every 6 years. So this is 2022. We're going to have an election May this year. And so far, the two frontrunners for the elections are Leni Robredo, who was a human rights lawyer, but is now currently the vice president of the Philippines, and Ferdinand Marcos Jr. You heard that right. Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator, has a son who is going to run for president for 2022. Well, is running for president because the campaigns are ongoing now. Like you can see his campaign ads, which are actually beautifully made, which tells you about how effective his people are.
And how much money they have, presumably.
Oh gosh, they have so much money because you know where they got that money from, and it's from the pockets of the people. It's from the mouths of the babies, like literal mouths of babies in my home province and in many other provinces back in 1985.
Yeah, what
and
would be
before
your
that,
kind of nutshell explanation of what made Marcos a dictator?
well, the thing with the first Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos, was that he was a strong man. He put the Philippines under martial law for 20 years and managed to maintain his regime for 20 years because of that particular position. And it created a sort of very legalistic, kind of clunky system, judicially, executively, and legislatively in the Philippines. But the point of it, the point of his power, was that he befriended the armed forces in a very deep way, while also allying with technocrats, economic, like folks who are very good at making money, essentially, and then taking loans from, and here you go, the Philippines was a former colony of the US, colony, straight up colony of the US. And after we were liberated after World War II, the US maintained very many economic and military ties to our island groups. And in a lot of ways, you know how there are a lot of puppet dictatorships in South America and Central America? That's the same thing that happened here. And it was he took a lot of loans from the US, for instance, and created a lot of infrastructure, which was great. Awesome. Infrastructure is necessary for a lot of things, but at the same time, it pushed us into such profound debt. So, and there we go. Like, we have these structures, macroeconomic structures of debt, of obligation, of just global servitude, basically, and slavery to more powerful bodies that made the first Marcos the First, look really pretty to the locals. And then he also orchestrated a threat, the NPA, the New People's Army, which is an armed communist wing of the Communist Party of the Philippines, and said that, oh, they're trying to take over the government. Oh, they tried to murder one of our senators. They tried to assassinate one of our senators. We have a really big problem. Boom, martial law. And then we were under martial law for 20 years. My parents, there was a curfew, for instance. And at one point, my dad, apparently when he was hanging out with one of his friends, tried to climb up an electrical post. He was a kid then, so he could do that. He tried to climb up an electrical post to dodge the curfew watchers, like that was just their life. And kids, and there were so many political prisoners, people who, anytime you made the slightest bit of criticism for the regime, boom, you're in jail because you violated curfew, because you did this and that, like small, tiny thing, but boom, you're in jail right now. And that exact same thing is happening right now without the martial law brand, shall we say, where dissenters are put in jail or outright murdered. One example would be Senator, and she is still a senator, Laila de Lima, who is in jail, and she has been in jail since the start of the present administration, the Duterte administration. And the thing is, those were trumped up as hell, like the charges against her, because Duterte's thing is not the NPA, but the war on drugs. And there was a case against her for drug trafficking. But that case was so obviously fake. Like, the witnesses were all underlings who were obviously paid off or threatened into saying what needed to be said to get her in jail. And on every single level, procedurally, substantively, that was an illegal arrest, an illegal detention, but she is still in jail. Why? Because she was very vocal about the Philippine, about the Duterte administration's lack of concern for the actual people that they are supposed to care for as the executive branch of the government. Um, but so that's the context. So we've got Marcos, Duterte, and now oncoming Marcos Jr., who will continue that legacy of nonsense, basically, and is being countered by Leni Robredo, who is, on the other hand, again, a former human rights lawyer, the widow, and we have the Philippines has a history with widows. We have a lot of widows who did a lot of pretty badass crap. Um, the widow of a former uh, executive executive department secretary who died under mysterious circumstances, of course. I mean, he died in a plane crash, and you know, lots of people die in plane crashes, but why? um, who had a reputation for being very, very service oriented. And Robredo continued that legacy of service orientation. And as vice president, she has successfully created a very strong but severely underfunded response to the pandemic. And she's continuing to, through her example, inspire a lot of the supporters that we have here to kind of give back to communities. So um, one of the, I guess, mean-spirited jokes that other parties have for her is that she's someone who just kind of gives out porridge, lugo, that's what it's called. And so what do the supporters do? All right, let's open a table, free porridge for whoever passes by, especially in low-income neighborhoods, slum areas, far-flung rural areas. Free porridge. Your kids get to eat for the day. Like, it's basically a good feedback loop in the face of a lot of the, again, nonsense that's going on. And so you have to wonder if there's such an inspirational kind of, for me anyway, logical response to, one, the rise of authoritarian fascism in the Philippines, and two, the horrors of and disruptions of a global pandemic that has taken so many lives. Why not just go for someone who is actually doing things instead of just like, you know, wow, 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 wow. But instead, what we're seeing is a very strong following for Marcos Jr. In fact, I'm sure folks from the United States have similar experiences that I'm not going to go into detail about. And the thing is, what I've noticed is that the ones who support Marcos Jr. are also the ones who are rabidly supportive still of Duterte. And what a lot of them are kind of focusing on is this strong man image, this very masculine, chauvinistic, I'm a badass, I'm correct, listen to me, you don't have to listen to anyone else, this is so cool, I'm so cool, you're so cool for listening to me, like, you know, that kind of validation that, you know, people who really haven't been in a very good place for a very long time can need very deeply and lean towards because they have this enormous void inside of themselves. And that leads me actually to the white supremacy culture discussion. And in the Philippines, because I'm not going to say we're homogenous ethnically, but at least phenotypically, a lot of people are Austronesian, so brown skinned, round eyes, rounded features. We all kind of look very similar to one another in a way. So there's a sense of, what's the word for it? The opposite of diversity, homogeneity to our ethnic makeup or racial makeup, shall we say? Because the Philippines has like over 100 ethnicities. So um, that I just wanted to make a little bit of a distinction there. And so white supremacy doesn't feel like something that's relevant to us. But given that we were colonized very, very thoroughly by the Spanish first, at some point the British, then the Spanish again, and then the Americans, and then Japan, the occupation in World War II, and then the Americans again, and constructively the Americans, and now China. Like there was an active campaign to erase who we were before we were colonized, and an active campaign to continue erasing who we are so that we are easy to control, easy to manipulate, and easy to draw into whatever foaming at the mouth campaign, you know, like the war on drugs, where there's a demonized other, and that demonized other is then kind of dogpiled on, so that actions like extrajudicial killings, random murders, even if I might say, trigger warning, rape and torture are justified. There's kind of this, I lost my train of thought. Sorry.
No, you've been doing so well explaining this to us. What was going through my head was, and I'm sitting here in Colombia, which was colonized by the Spanish, and then I have a lot to learn about what's actually happening in Colombia, but a lot of U.S. influence here, of course. But the idea of a country like the Philippines being colonized over and over again, and imagining that, for those of you that have seen the videos or attended workshops about white supremacy culture patterns with me, if you remove the words white supremacy and you just look at what the patterns are, you recognize them. We recognize them in our workplaces, in families, in movements, in politics. And it's, you don't have to be white,
Exactly.
to fall under the spell, of these patterns that have been trained into us so well. You could call them
Colonial?
colonizing patterns, right?
Because actually, oh yeah, I finally caught the thread of my
Yeah,
thought.
go.
Sorry. That's the thing. A lot of the ways that we think nowadays has been kind of influenced by this profound need to be approved of by this big invisible beard in the sky. And I'm not just talking about Christianity or whatever, but there's always this kind of big invisible, not just any kind of beard, but like a snowy white beard. And like it's this big masculine authority figure who is very often white, who is almost exclusively white. And it's made a lot of people feel like, I need to do anything at all, just to be approved of, to be said that I'm valid, to be told that I'm okay. And a lot of that manifested in the context that I just shared, in how people are, again, like foaming at the mouth to support folks like Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who is, like, oh my God, he's the son of a dictator, an actual dictator, who murdered a minimum of 3,000 people under his regime, jailed countless others, and disappeared so many more. And it's indicative of, again, that void created by the repeated erasure of colonialism and constructive colonialism, or neo-colonialism, shall we say, that has been imposed on the Philippines and countless other countries in the global South, where we have been deprived of this profound sense of self and connection with community and with our own ecosystems, so that we turn to authority figures so that we can feel like people. And that way of thinking is very much rooted in the colonial enterprise. Because what did the Spanish first do when they arrived here? They converted people to Catholicism. And then after converting people to Catholicism, they said, your local beliefs are evil and they come from Satan, and we're going to burn your spiritual leaders, and we're going to burn your spiritual documents, and we're going to say anything that you do is paganism or superstition, and they're bad, and so therefore you're bad. And if you're bad, you have to come to mama. You have to come to mama church, or you have to come under daddy crown, and be a good citizen. Otherwise, you're a cimarron. You're a remontado. You're a bandit. Basically, you're returning to the mountains, and you're being uncivilized, and you're a wild person, and you don't deserve to be cared for by society. But here's the thing: people care for each other. Like, that's just what we do. We're such a social species that if we are left alone in say, like in jail, someone goes into solitary confinement, that's a punishment. You go, like, a little stir crazy because there's no one else there. The biological response to touch tells us that we are such a profoundly physical, social, and altruistic group of animals, that to isolate us turns us into not us. And that's what colonial and white supremacist cultural patterns do. They deprive us of ourselves in very many ways, and makes us afraid, and make us needy because we are afraid. And so we'll do anything just to get that little bit of validation.
Yeah, and that reminds me of like the cult dynamics workshop as well, and the characteristics of cults, and how, it's completely related to white supremacy culture patterns. it's just taking it, looking at it in terms of leadership and the sense of belonging, not belonging, the fear of being shamed, ostracized. So, in terms of the elections, so I can see how, unfortunately, there can be an appeal about a dictator, because if we have a society with catastrophic climate change happening in your country, a pandemic, you want that strong man to come in and say, this is what we're going to do, and just do what I say. And then you're saying that there's this counter candidate, the current vice president, who has a more human approach to caring for people. Where do you see the electorate? Who are the people who are going to vote for her? And who are the people who are still not sure who they should vote for?
Frankly, I cannot fully say like precisely who, but I do know that someone, for instance, who has observed and is willing to be changed by those observations is likelier to vote for Robredo, whereas someone who is a little bit more set in their ways, who wants things to be the way they were, or is feeling a little nostalgic for a past that doesn't really exist, will say, oh, but the days of martial law were peaceful because there was less crime. So maybe Marcos Jr. will come back and do that again and make things better again and make the Philippines great again, if you know what I mean. It will appeal to those kinds of personalities, but also, and this is a personal opinion based on the fact that I am very privileged to have grown up in a loving household, and so have a profound sense of internal stability for who I am, because my parents did the right thing by me and my siblings. And so I feel safe enough to be changed by my observations. And so the ones who have that kind of sense of stability, who have been held by their communities, by their families, by even just their friends, can say, oh, wait a minute, this is the logical choice. Whereas those who don't have that same sense of safety deep inside them, who have, again, that void, that gaping need to just be accepted and validated in some way, will turn instead to the strong man who will solve everything. Because the problem, I think, with Robredo's campaign is that it requires work, and it acknowledges that the work of rehabilitating a nation from a pandemic, from a regime that has not been very much in the interest of the local, of its constituents, is a group effort, a community effort that needs everyone to get together, pick up, and like suck up, which leads me back to, again, that loving response to collapse. I hate seeing the term suck it up because it feels like such a insensitive way of saying your problems are not valid. But let's face it, if we're going to get through anything, we're going to have to suck it up. The problems are valid, your fears are real, and you are a human being who deserves love, respect, and that quiet space where you can grow inside yourself. But we also have to move past that infantile need to need and act. And that is a truly loving response, to act, to put ourselves in the midst of the problem, to put our money, ourselves, where our mouths are, and say, yes, I'm going to go out in the middle of a pandemic and distribute porridge to depressed communities. I mean, okay, so that can sound a little condescending. And for some folks, that is where they want to go. I want to feel good about myself, so I'm going to go and give porridge to the poor people. And by the poor people, I mean that with 2 capital P's, because I've got noblesse oblige, and I'm better than everyone. Oh, but there's still kind of this need still. The fact of the matter is you're doing something. And in the face of collapse, it's the something, the response, the call and response of being part of a community that helps create the community. So it doesn't matter what your community is, but you have to start where you are. You cannot, there are in the global north a lot of like volunteer situations, for instance, where young global north people come over here and try and save the little brown children. And it creates a patronage situation where the little brown children feel all sad and like, oh, I'm so helpless. Thank you, great white savior, And that's not cool, because we have to be able to help ourselves. That's the only way. That's the only way we're going to have the ability to come together so that we have the capacity to help you too. If I'm talking right now to a global north audience, a white middle class audience, we know that you guys are just as sick as us, but in many different, profoundly painful ways. But we have an existential issue. And if you're just going to muddy the waters with, nice feelings, shall we say, or propriety and making everyone else feel held and nice, that's not going to do anything. If my roof collapses on me because of another super typhoon, which is bound to come next year, this year, bound to come, it's just going to happen, and I die, It doesn't matter how many good thoughts and prayers you send over to me. And if, for instance, one of my friends gets COVID, and because she doesn't have the funds to pay for it, because we don't have the resources for public medicine, she's just going to die. Well, I mean, if she gets the severe form of COVID, say she's vaccinated, she did everything she could, but she doesn't have enough money, her O2 levels went down, and now she has to be intubated, but she can't afford to get intubated. She's just going to die, and she's going to leave a baby, like a newborn baby, without its mother. And that kid's just going to grow up without their mom. And that's just going to happen. I'm being really brutal here because reality is brutal. And if we sit in our climate anxiety and just kind of wring our hands like, oh no, climate ending, climate crisis, that's not going to do anything. We are going to have to take decisive steps, take to the streets, no, in fact, hell, I'm all for Molotov cocktails, frankly, like violent action. Because survival, again, that existential threat is there. Collapse has been happening for us, for me and Heather, for indigenous groups in the United States, for indigenous groups in India, indigenous groups here, for non-indigenous groups, and like, everywhere in the planet. Collapse continues to happen, and we are dying. I'm going to say that again. We are dying. And that's just happening. So we have to get off our asses and say, all right, I have loving feelings. I have good thoughts. I'm going to take those good thoughts and loving feelings, and I'm going to turn them into a decision. A decision, say, to, I don't know. Frankly, how do we fight the tide? How do we breathe in water that's choking us? So maybe that means doing something like protesting. But even that is frankly not very effective. So we have to think about what works for us. Like say, okay, yeah.
Yeah, what is going on in the Philippines in terms of pushback against fascism, authoritarianism?
Oh, well, all right. Yeah, that's actually a great question, Heather, because that is actually another way that people can help each other. And this happened early in 2021, around March of 2021, where just one person put a table on a street corner, left vegetables, left some rice, and said, take what you need, give what you can. Like just a little sign there. And it grew into a movement that spread throughout the country where people would line up to either give or get just enough for today's meal. Like it's about it. And it doesn't have to be a movement. You don't have to inspire other people. You just have to do what you can do to make your world, even if it's just your house and maybe your next door neighbor, a place where people feel like they are safe. And just being very present and aware that, okay, so let's talk about, say, I have a next door neighbor whose kid has some trouble with, I don't know, English, like their English language thing, because they're kind of malnourished because there isn't enough food on the table because their dad lost his job. So what do? Oh, I made too much caldereta today. Like caldereta is this beef dish with tomato sauce. It's but anyway, yeah, I made too much today. I'm going to bring some over to them so that kid can have a good meal and can, be fully present for their lessons for that day. Even something as small as that, where you made a connection with someone else and you asked them human to human, how are you doing and what do you need? And they say, I need this. And you say, I need this. And, there's that sense that you are part of something. It's not
Mutuality. Mm-hmm. What? So if this vice president who's countering, that's like the offering a different sort of, country under her leadership, just to check with you, because we have in the US and the UK, I wouldn't say that the opposition in either of those countries could be described in the way that you're describing her. So I'm wondering, what's her catch? Like, is she as perfect? Are we going to, say, oh, she's we can't criticize her because
like
she's
presidential
perfect. Yeah. Or what's the realistic take on it? And how would she have, either way, how has she managed to get into that position? Because in the US and the UK, we see, kind of very centrist opposition. And I'm still counting Biden as opposition, even though he's now president. It sounds different. It sounds more extreme that you have like the very blatant dictator, and then you have someone who's really, sounding like a like an angel that comes and wants to help everybody.
Well, that's the thing. We have to remember that she's human. So any motivations that she has are going to be flawed. And whatever she does is not going to come from a place of perfect logic and perfect intelligence and perfect emotional depth, but rather from a limited human being who will make decisions sometimes based on sheer panic. And then we also have to take into consideration the position of president itself, which is a very limited position, especially in the Philippines, because of the experience with the first Marcos. The powers of the executive are very much hobbled and taken and controlled by its co-equal powers, the legislative and the judiciary, which I won't go into. So if, say, she's interested in passing a law that requires that, I don't know, the free school meals, which is something that, like, is a thing that happens in the US and in UK and in a lot of other places. She's interested, say, in passing a law like that in the Philippines. She's going to have to jump through some really, really rough executive hoops. And it's not helped by a Congress that is essentially a bunch of cowards, a Congress and a Senate that is very much a bunch of cowards who will go with whoever is the most likely to win kind of situation. And of course, even if we have the best of thoughts and the best of intentions, and I'm not saying that she does, we're going to make mistakes. I'm even in the best case scenario. One of the things that she has to do is please the electorate while pleasing the Congress and towing the line with the judiciary. And that means, again, like a slide towards centrism, where what we need is radical, profoundly radical societal change. One of the food sovereignty areas that I'm interested in, for instance, is land to the tiller in genuine agrarian reform in the Philippines, because huge tracts of land are still being owned by, if not individual families, corporations that profoundly disenfranchise small communities and small farmers who are providing the food that we eat. And she's not going to, I know for a fact that she's not going to do anything about that. That's just, that's something that has to come from the locals. That's something that may have to be fought for with fire and blood, because it's already being fought for with fire and blood. The Bloody Sunday massacre of March 2021, where several people were murdered for being land rights activists. Not just land rights activists, but farmers on their land trying not to be disenfranchised by a big family that wanted to take their land. Boom, murdered. The Tumandok Nine, who were indigenous leaders who were protesting the creation of a dam on their ancestral land, murdered December 30, 2020. These things, the Sagay, I could go on and on. Like, just so many people, so many massacres, just people dying, people disappearing. And so, we have to fight with fists, with pens, with our bloody cooking pots, like just making porridge or fried rice, fried rice and dried fish. That's a traditional Filipino breakfast for a lot of people in low income areas. Fried rice, dried fish, a little bit of salt, a little bit of vinegar. That's it. That's enough. If that's all you can do, that's enough. If you can make someone feel safe so that they can make a decision that is helpful for their communities, that can be enough. And that's not something that Robredo can make everyone do. In fact, there's no making anyone do that. That has to come from us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm often trying to think of ways to kind of pop that bubble that we see the white Western middle class people in, and I was raised that way myself. The interconnectedness, the interdependence, the idea that if we can't figure this out, if we can't figure out how to not be paternalistic, but how to get out of the way.
Exactly.
To ensure that the Philippines can thrive. If we can't figure that out as white Western middle class people, then we are not going to have an appropriate response to collapse. And it sure as hell won't be loving.
No.
If we're sacrificing people around the world for the safety of the privileged few.
And actually, that's because privilege knows no skin color. And I, as a member of the upper middle class, had to work very, very hard to pop that bubble of comfort that I had the privilege of growing up with, in order to to really see, you know, that there is something very wrong going on. And I'm not bringing myself up or anything. I'm more saying that that is work that every single individual has to do on their own by themselves. And privilege can make things very comfortable and very nice so that you can play, like be willfully not paying attention. Because, for instance, there was this enormous land grab that happened sometime in early 2008 in Mindanao, in the municipality of Sumilao. And the farmers at Mindanao, this is Manila. This is the butt end of the Philippines. That's Mindanao. And that's well over 700 kilometers away. They marched on foot, taking like barges across islands, and then marching to the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Agrarian Reform to protest the land grab. And someone I know said, oh my God, why didn't they just take a plane? You know, like, that's not the point. Girl, listen, you know, pay attention. They cannot take the plane. The fact that they're marching means something. It's not about convenience. It's about the fact that they are losing their land. And land is life. Land is the reason why they continue to survive and can feed their children, and why they can feed themselves. And you know, that's the mindset that we have to pop. The idea that we know what other people are thinking, that we know their experience. We have to kind of accept that we live in a world of uncertainty, and that we don't know what we don't know. So the Sumilao farmers, for instance, we don't know the precise reasons why they marched. We don't know. We know the bigger reason, the reason that they called out and marched on the streets for, but we don't know the individual, what's the word for it? The individual motivations for that. And to say, oh, I was thinking what they were thinking, and that what they were thinking was wrong and stupid because they could have just taken an airplane, is an incredibly insensitive thing to do. And unfortunately, that's a thing that a lot of white Western middle-class people have a tendency to do. To think, oh, they're thinking the way I'm thinking. And because they're thinking differently from how I'm thinking, that's stupid, that they're wrong. That's very paternalistic and very insensitive.
And that's why, yeah, like in the How to Be an Ally workshop, it's around cultivating that humility and curiosity to say, what am I missing? What don't I get about the world, the way it works, the way the system works, the way it the way it exploits, the way it's causing suffering around the world? What don't I get about it that means that I don't know how to respond appropriately to what's happening in the world, because I don't get how the world works? And that's why I need to be able to get close to people who do know, and who also know how to survive without the benefit of the system. We need those skills. We need each other, which is why the project is around bringing this group of privileged people to a place where they realize that, and then will take the time to watch a video of someone in the Philippines describing how they're being killed by a political system and by the climate, which through no fault of their own is changing and bringing about these, these collapse situations.
And I think that would kind of bring us to sort of a conclusion, I think, of just how important it is to listen, and not just, listen to this person, listen to that person, listen to, these people because they look or sound the right way, but just to listen, just to find it within yourself, to find that courage, that still point in your heart where you can say, I'm okay and I'm ready to listen. I think that that's really all we can start with. And from there, things can blossom because we don't know where things are going to go.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. And I'm sure that we're going to have other conversations in the future. There's a lot that we have to hear from you and about the work you do. And so we'll plan another one soon. Thank you so much.
You too. It's a lot of fun. I got to rant a little